Vamos aqui.
Posso sair do vídeo um momento ou não?
Então, vamos lá, então. Michel, você começou?
Ok.
Muito obrigado. Bom, muito obrigado. É com muita satisfação que a gente inicia mais uma webinário internacional. E hoje ele é multi-internacional, porque nós estamos aqui com a felicidade com a professora Melvina, que foi responsável por toda a organização. A gente está com uma nossa convidada que está na Itália, mas eu queria saber da professora Melvina, qual que é o idioma do nosso webinário de hoje?
Inglês.
Inglês? Muito bem. So, thank you so much for everyone, and hi everyone for joining us today for this webinar. And I'm pretty sure that it's going to be a very important discussion today. And on behalf of the Graduate Studies and Research Office of Unifesp, I would like to thank you, Professor Francesca De Clicch. Professor Francesca, she's an associated professor from the Dipartimento di Scienza della Comunicazione e Studi Umanistici e Internazionali the Università di Urbino Carla Bo. I would like to thank you very much for being here today with us. And I would like also to thank you, Professor Melvina. Professor Melvina was working behind the scenes to guarantee that you will have today a very special webinar. Professor Melvina Araújo, she's an anthropologist, associated professor in the social science department at Unifesp, and associated researcher at CEBRAP, and coordinator of the group of the students on meditation and authority, GMA. Among his most important publications, there are the books Das Ervas Medicinais, a Fitoterapia, do Corpo à Alma, Missionários da Controlata e os Índios Macuxi de Roraima, O Antropólogo e Sua Bíblia, Religião e Conflito, em partnership with Cristina Vital Cunha, Cultura Afro-Brasileira, Temas Fundamentais em Ensino, Pesquisa e Extensão, together with José Carlos Gomes da Silva, as well articles such as Hienas Missionárias e Crianças, um estudo sobre relatos do infanticídio no Quênia, em África Estúria. Antropologia na Missão, relações entre etnologia confessional de Padre Schmidt e antropologia acadêmica em Religião e Sociedade. Joseph Wanhin and Q Catholic Catechist in Vibrant, Between Missions, Myth and Tradition, and the production of texts by the About of the Makushi and Contemporary and Social Sciences Missions, and Misiones Religiosas y Políticas Identitarias, las Misiones de los Consolatinos en Kenia y Roraima, en Memoria Americana, Cuadernos de Etnohistoria. So I would like to thank you very much for being here today, Professor Melvina, for working for us. It's a pleasure to have you as our colleague here in UFESP and of your amazing work. Professor Francesca is still there. So, Professor Francesca, grazie mille per tue disponibilità e collaborazione nell'essere qui con noi. E con grande soddisfazione che Unifesp riceve un rinomato ricercatore come voi. Grazie mille.
Okay. Grazie e obrigada pela invitação. Agora eu fui convidada a falar em inglês, então vou fazer a apresentação em inglês. Mas obrigada por ser convidada neste interessante convite. E overall, to discuss this book that has been interesting to actually read and in detail, and which I will talk about now. Is it you, Melvina, that you're going to start, or is me?
Yes.
We can listen to you, Professor Melvina. I think you can.
So I should start.
I think Professor Melvina will introduce you a little bit more and to let the audience to understand how to participate. Isn't it, Professor Melvina?
Yes, it is.
Please, thank you.
Thank you very much, Camille, for your presentation and for the organization of the webinar, Unifesp webinar. I would like to thank all people that are here with us, and especially Francesca de Clich. And I would like to apologize to Professor Francesca de Clich due to the wrong presentation of her title on the event poster. Contrary to what appears on the poster, she is an associate professor at the University of Urbino Carlo Bo, president of ASAI, Associazione degli Studi Africani in Italia, and board member of World Council of Anthropological Association. Her recent publications are Kinship Studies on the Move and Introduction to the Migratory Journeys of Kindred, Children are our pension, livelihood diversification, social security, and kinship constraints among East African refugees, Nasib Bondo and other rebel slaves and the liberty of Gosha, reassessment 1835-1906. Translocal connections across the Indian Ocean, Swahili networks on the move, introduction, rethink migration memories and diasporic practices from the perspective of the African continent. African slavery in documentary film, Why Now? Codifying memories for film of bank slavery and forced migrants of the past across the Western Indian Ocean. Professor Francesca de Clich will discuss the results of the research project Difference in Plural Context. Later, I will answer the question asked by her, and then we will open for questions from the public, which can be asked by chat or I don't know if it's possible, oral question. Maybe it will be possible. The works that will be discussed in this seminar are the result of the difference in the project Difference and Plural Context, which was supported by FAPESP for its realization, and address the question of producing difference in everyday interactions. Looking at the different suppose observing situations of conflict, which are invariably permeated by power relations, and examining strategies, researching social codes and norms, observing how different actors interact at different scales and levels, to, in this way, better understand what is in question in the researched context. In addition, we seek to combine an overlapping effort between the description and the analysis of the experienced situations, the history of the perspective developed by her author, through the narrative of her geographical and conceptual paths and displacements, with the care in observation and analysis of terms and expressions used by intellectuals in the field or found in documents and in the bibliography. In other words, we focus on the social dynamics situated in the agents of differences, whether they are marked, institutionalized, displaced, or in dispute, which contribute to the social and political formations in the studied spaces times. The performance of the analysis presented here implied the congregation of ethnographical words in the fields, in the virtual social networks, in documentary research, historical, anthropological, bibliography research, as well as collective discussions within the group of study on mediations and alterity, GEMA, on the individual research, and the common perspective of the project difference in plural contexts, seeking to observe specific issues in each context as well as themes and problems that pervade them. In this way, what amalgamates the research carried out in contexts as different as those presented here, like Bosnia-Herzegovina, Kenya, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, and Angola, is the existence of a question, the difference, that guides all the research that make up the project and not the ethnographic context in which they were carried out. In short, the differences pointed out in our research provide parameters of socio-anthropological interpretation of the modes of interactions from which the actors involved in these contexts establish relationships marked by the different positions they occupy in the arenas in which they operate. That's it. I would like to invite Francesca to speak now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Melvina, may I start then? Can you hear me? Yes. Right. I thank you very much for the chance to be able to discuss this interesting book. And I would like to say that the book starts introducing the issue of difference, and the issue of difference is considered crucial in the promotion of racial equality, gender equality, on which should be based the accept of citizenship, inclusions, and the right to be different without being in an unequal position. But the creation of difference is then part of government technologies redefining classification criteria, ethnic, religious, and national, to uncover specific national projects. Using difference and fostering difference, the state can create inequality. So overlapping different categories, citizenship, class, gender, race, and language, religions, and ethnicities, produces unequal social positions which lead to unequal access to rights and goods. The book proposes, instead of adopting practical categories as if it were given, to problematize and present those factors which contributed to the construction of such categories and their meanings. Thus, some of the articles are very much historical, others are more ethnographical, but all authors present a process of constructions of difference in various ethnographic encounters. Andrea Carolina shows how, in the dissolution of Yugoslavia after the war, mechanisms of ethnic national differences were constructed in linguistic terms, schooling context, historiography, and territorial separation. Clayton Guerrero talks about Mozambique and discusses the extent to which religious institutions like the Universal Church of the Divine Kingdom and the Zion Church and the traditional doctors, the Tinyanga, are all involved in producing differences and describe them in an oppositional category of tradition, civilization. Melvina de Araújo discusses the construction of the category of Kikuyuness in colonial times, when disputes on which was the true way of being Kikuyu in Kenya was going. Debate was about whether true traditions were those which had been codified in writing or those transmitted orally, and from there strategies of identify safeguard were set up. For the case of the Fulas of Gabo, Enrico Brito describes the way ethnic differences are manipulated as categories for accusation and are used to mark political disputes. Marina Felicio Santos present the way in which women's equality was fostered by their participations in the fight for liberations in Mozambique. And Rodrigo Domenech de Souza, how the lines of difference constructed during the independence war in Mozambique were still left people in anger. Finally, for Angola, Paulo Muller describes how the categories of traditions and modernities are used to classify certain symbols and practices to mark differences. Now, I found the book fascinating for the interesting articles and the different ways that give account to differences in several parts of Africa and beyond. And so I would say Professor Melvina Araujo's chapter is situated in the context of Kenya in 119 and 160s, in the middle of the British colonization and the end of colonization, and the rising of the Mau Mau resistance movement to colonization. In this context, the Christian missionaries were important agents of change, and their role in the process of schooling of the society created very interesting dynamics which can be analyzed to highlight the debates and the negotiations which were going on within the Kenyan society at the time, and especially among the Kikuyu. She describes a post-colonial situation in which the Catholic Consolata fathers attained a crucial role in the schooling of the Kikuyu, and passes to recount the reasons why this occurred, even though the Catholic Italians were considered the second-class people in the British Empire. First, she clarifies the Catholic Consolata missionaries spoke the local language, unlike the other Protestant and Anglican missionaries. So they were seen differently by the local population. Education was seen as one of the mandates of the colony in Africa, and the task was ascribed to religious missionaries. Schooling was considered important by the Kikuyu, who tried to appropriate it in order to get the power offered by alphabetization. In fact, education and going to school was seen as apprehending the secret of the British in order to defeat them in the future. The first Kikuyu chief who expressed a demand for education was Chief Kauri, who allowed to open a school in his village in 1902. Description of the strategies used by the Consolata fathers to organize education in different locations are presented, training indigenous school teachers to open a number of schools. Then in 1920, the British needed trained Africans for the workforce of people who should attend the need of the colonizers. And as soon as the local Native Council was founded in 1924, from this council foundation, the natives started organizing the independent schools. Yet, the colonial government prohibited the opening of those schools in places where there were already missionaries. In 1926, it was opened the Alliance of High School, the only one which allowed students to proceed for studying at university. Professor Araujo recounts the controversy over circumcisions that was present in Kenya, but of course was there also in Tanzania and other places of the British Empire. The Presbyterians prohibited circumcision to their followers, so that the 90% of them left the church. Part of them founded independent African churches, which adopted models of Protestant churches and built also schools close to the missions. Thus, some Catholic missions started to do the circumcisions in their building, but those were only recognized by the local people, as recorded by the Consolata missionary Padre Perlo when it was performed by a Kikuyu elder. Thus, the author describes the debate about sudden changes of the tribalization, which were thought of as being dangerous, as they could have made the local institution falling apart without allowing people to enter anyway the social strata of the civilized, as the Europeans were considered. Education was seen as possibly dangerous in this regard. Those days, at the beginning of the 1920s, several Kikuyu associations, the KA and the KCA, had the aim of claiming education like the one of the Europeans to make them able to take the position then only reserved to Europeans. And then movements were created about this. the Kikuyu Independent School Associations and the Kikuyu Karinga Educational Associations proposed schools different from those of the missionaries. They had some variations, including the teaching, of course, on Kikuyu traditions. In conclusion, the education which had been thought of as a way to prepare workforce by the colonizers were rather seen as a form to enter the administrative and political mechanisms by the locals. Thus, the government discouraged and boycotted the association and prohibited that KCA raised money without governmental authorization. The Education Ordinance in 1930 allowed closing this independent school, which did not respect the approved curriculum. This, of course, diminished the possibility of offering education to Kikuyus and had been seen as one of the causes of the rise of the Mau Mau rebellion. The chapter goes on describing the way in which consulate father positions themselves in the contest and were trying to open more schools, but in the 1940s they became prisoners of the British, and after the war they had to go back, new missions having to start again to approach the communities. And also shows the activities that the Consolata fathers started with women offering courses on needlework, which became very much appreciated. And the Araujo talks about also about the Mau Mau revolts and position of the Mau Mau movement in relation to education, so that the Mau Mau at some point also attacked and destroyed some of the schools. And there are reports of communities that reconstructed them, so that at this point they were so interested in education for their own children. Now, it's not possible to sum up here the entire chapter for the rich information because makes an historical reconstruction of the events using both written sources as well as oral sources and interviews with missionaries who were there. It's however important to highlight some aspects of how difference was constructed. Clearly, schooling was a process that introduced a big factor of change, fostering difference between those who could and those who could not study. In this case, the Africans shouldn't go to the right school as the other. The author goes ahead also mentioning that Wangari Maathai, the Kenyan environmental activist who became Nobel Prize, was one of the students of the School of the Consolata Fathers. So the achievement of being able to go to good schools was then something that made a difference. But in addition to this, also that much of the later ruling class was able to become so because many of them attended those schools. Difference, however, was also evident in the colonizer societies. Catholic missionaries, such as Consolata fathers, were considered second class as compared to the British Protestant. And the Kikuyu advocated appropriation of the British secrets by studying on the basis of what had been asserted by a Kikuyu prophet of the 19th century, Muguya Kibiru, who said that the Yaut should study the secrets of the British so to be able to fight them afterwards. Here an interesting aspect that the Kikuyu followed a traditional prophet in their choice to seek education. An aspect that marked a difference was also clothing. Wearing modern clothes was compulsory to get into school, and thus a sort of new way, a fashion raised for this. Schools of sewing machine became also desirable for women. And as Mebina says, wearing differently as well as dominating other codex of Western behavior is part of the process of eliciting the difference, in which are written experiences, social relations, positioning of the subject, subjectivities, and identity. So the article is a fascinating story of how the process of educating through the school was a huge arena of negotiation to create differences through education. I have to say that it was even more interesting to me because I have had a chance to study with later Professor Bernardi, and so many of the things he was saying actually were backed up by this knowledge that Melvina is more than he ever brought. So, but I would also talk about Guinea-Bissau now. Enrico Sousa Brito dedicates his article in the regional boundaries in area of fieldwork at the boundaries with Senegal in the north and Guinea-Conakry in the east, where stereotypes concerning the groups previously with slave status and later discriminated against as second-class people. He describes issues concerning the Fulas of Gabu he was able to observe while being a guest of one important family of the area, gave birth to many regulars, meaning chiefs of dominions. This is a research carried out in between 2018 and 2019. His argument is that the experience of fight for the liberation of Guinea-Bissau contributed to the solidification of certain ethnical stereotypes and to the attribution of homogenizing behaviors to all the Fulas, especially negative stereotypes about certain groups, like the Fula, not only solidified but also became part of what are nowadays narratives used in political discourse. Thus, Brito asserts that the construction of difference has been pursued even after independence along the lines of a certain social stratification existing in the past. Thus, the subaltern in the society of today are the descendants of the slaves of the dominant class in the past. Generally, argues Brito, public policies look at homogenizing certain social strata, and homogenization of social groups may be thought of as government technology which looks at the control of the state over the population. Thus, for the construction of stereotypical images of Fuller's ethnic and their images crystallized, state the authors, one has to look at anthropological literature on Creole and Creole society. In fact, in Guinea-Bissau, the elite of Luso-Africans were considered enemies of the ethnic African societies. There was a sentiment of superiority in the Creole elite in the case of Cabo Verdean, who had been sent to Guinea-Bissau by the Portuguese for administrative offices. Before independence, there was a need of people who would join the army, that certain narratives created positive or negative images of certain ethnic groups also in this perspective. The Fula were then thought of as a group that could be part of army to fight for the independence. In 1973, independence was declared, but thereafter another dynamic of differentiation occurred. In the process of independence, the Creole elite was successful in transferring hostility from the existing Creoles towards the Fula by spreading narratives about them as collaborationists and as models of primitive society to be overcome. Slowly, though, the stereotypes and negative feelings toward the Lusophone Africans who had been collaborationists were diverted on the Fulas, who were then accused of collaboration with Portuguese. Those constructions of images are still used in the present, and ethnicity labels goes together with accusation of collaboration. So concerning the way difference is constructing here, it is clear that the author that differences are constructed during the period of independence and after independence on class lines and in ethnicization, as well as dichotomy categories such as primitive, modern, and collaborationist revolutionaries, which were used to draw the lines of separation. And I would wonder, in this case, I would have a question about to what extent, if he is here, to what extent the media also work with these categories now. The work of Andrea Carolina is a research concerning continuous maintenance of difference in the post-war between Bosnia and Serbia. A difference, however, which was created by the war through violence and by forcing people who were first united in being divided in different territories separated from the others they used to be in. Fieldwork is based on innumerable times. Often data stem from informal meetings when she did not think about getting this data. And the last fieldwork is in 2019 to 2020. Thus, part of her insights come from exactly anthropological knowledge, in the sense exactly of this informal data that stem from the field without one actually asking for it. So the story is a country which was united and has been trying to be separated all the time. Serbians, Croats, and Bosnians, not only geographically but also linguistically, and making different dictionaries for languages for a language that is basically the same. The drama of difference, which is created on the body of women who were raped, where the rape was used as a weapon of war to create difference, and thus a new nation. And Rodrigo de Souza starts talking about Mozambique, and we have a number of papers on Mozambique here, and discusses relations between governors and ex-combatants, as well as common people in an area of southern Mozambique, Chinguinguire, a village close to Inhambane in southern Mozambique. The phrase that sums up the results of the entire discussion is a phrase heard in the field in 2019 concerning the ex-presidents of Mozambique. O Gebusa sempre comeu sozinho, that is, the president did not share what he had with others, left his people hungry. This is a phrase epitomizing the image of a chief who is not able to provide enough food for his subjects or citizens. This chapter also is based on historical sources and describes this area as one in which, during colonial times, local people were often expropriated from land to be given to colonists interested in farming. At some point, it was compulsory farming on products like rice and cotton, and male hand power was exported to the mines in South Africa. In this area, the independence was then a phase of great change when the Frelimo, the ruling party, formed a provincial government, sent in this municipal village at Chinguinguire 250 ex-combatants, women and men who had participated to the fight against the Portuguese in between 1964 and 1974. The article reports a number of local oral historical sources which describe changes when the Frelimo arrived. The local authority became secondary as people, or the Frelimo took account of the territory. Then, when the Frelimo arrived, local authorities and the ceremonial basis of their power were discredited against by fostering new narratives against obscurantism and modernism, which created a new line of difference, separating those who were the old authorities and the new leadership. However, the epilogue of the chapter is that this was a rich farming area, while nowadays does not produce enough for survival of many people, maybe even due to the wrong distribution of the land, which is not tilled by the concessionaires. Lack of sufficient food is testified by the fact that so many children arrive malnourished in the health facilities of the area. Yet, those people who have at least some food in all occasions are still those related to the ex-combatants. They were given the best land close to the river, although they may not plough the land anymore. Although they may be old now, the land are still allocated to them. In a sense, the article depicts a context in which assistance was done to ex-combatants without sufficient attention to the well-being of all. It seems that new differences in this case were created by the remolding of the power structure which followed the independence, while during colonial times people were impoverished by the imposition of specific farming policies and also by forced labor. Later, the independent government did not redistribute equally enough the resources, and local people are still suffering hunger. Thus, they say governors eat on their own. Without land, there is no food, and this seems to be the leitmotif of the history of the local inhabitants of the area. Marina Felicia Santos also talks about Mozambique, and in this case, she talks about the role of women in the process of liberation of Mozambique. The chapter is on the role women played in the process of national liberation movement in Mozambique. It's a piece of historical review in which the other riches in the region and some oral sources who were the first women to rebel and those who developed capacity to foster a distinct social movement towards women's emancipation. The Frelimo seems to have been one of the first nationalist movements in Africa asserting that liberation of women should go ahead together with revolution to include systematically women's participation. Yet, while some authors argue Marina traced the start of the participation of women with the initial Frelimo's meetings, a little after its birth in 1962, she asserts that women were already alive before this armed independentist movement existed. Thus, she reports of an event mentioned by author Casimiro, in which women organized a strike altogether to rebel against the Portuguese forced labor in 1947. 7,000 women altogether rejected the work in the cotton plantation and burned the seeds into estates. This is just one example that it was not only the input of the political will of personalities like Samora Machel and others who made the women participated in the revolution for independence, but also an agency already present before them. It is in fact that since mid-19th century, man workforce was drained towards South Africa, Rhodesia, and Nyasaland to work in mines and plantations so that women became in charge of the economy within the family. Certainly, as she describes in different parts of the chapter, Samora Machel, who had a doctorate abroad and knew life in other countries, strongly pushed within the flame of the point that without help of women there would then not be revolution nor liberation. The article is mostly based on written sources and some oral sources of important female ex-combatants like Monica Chitupila, who, as privileged witness, asserts a conviction that before their independence women were twice slaves of the enemies and of the husbands. Thus, the freedom of nowadays Mozambican women results from the achievements obtained during the fight for liberation. Although the article does not address directly the creation of difference as other ones, one can say that political movement which led to the independence of Mozambique in a way pretended to cancel certain differences in the access to benefits that have been brought about by the Portuguese colonial regime. I would like to hear some more of the ethnographic information about this, to hear what other women says about this. Clayton Silva Guerrera instead starts presenting the way Portuguese colonization imposed differentiation in the country by constructing the locals as indigenous, primitive, with no chances to arrive to any level of civilization such as that of the whites. They also imposed the formation of a class of assimilated, which were those indigenous with some education and that could rise to the level of civilized whites, as they had learned how to behave properly and how to speak Portuguese. In this framework, Clayton asserts that the old colonial dichotomy opposing civilizations versus traditions keeps being internalized into discourse, produced by the local offers of rituals and spiritual experiences while modulating their presence. Thereafter, Clayton starts presenting how certain independent churches, such as Zion, negotiate the space and consensus by a discourse that promises to be able to block the problems caused by the feitiçeiros, traditional healers or witches, through spiritual therapies that include rituals, which, however, are considered traditional. In contrast, the IURD, Universal do Reino de Deus Church, which presents itself modern, because coming from modern Brazil, shows itself as an institution that knows how to deal with traditions, because belong to a more civilized background. Differences can be seen in the way the temples of the two churches are built. The Zionist in hidden Maputo's remote borough, an alternative, the IURD, has a more modern building and provide more comfortable spaces for prayers. But many Mozambicans states that who looks for spiritual therapies in Maputo says that presenting oneself as civilized church, original from a modern country, is not enough to really differentiate oneself from competitors for the sacred space. It is needed to persuade those Mozambicans that the bishop or the pastor of those churches are able to deal with the spiritual tradition to the same extent of the feiticeiros and the Tinyanga. So, the case of Donna Regina's ethnographic records, which says that in addition to the Zion prophet, she had been looking for help at the Tinyanga, and she had also attended other Pentecostal churches to solve the problems. She said that the Zioni and the Tinyanga know better than others how to deal with spiritual world in Mozambique. Or the case of Donna Judith, who had been treated in different spiritual centers, or the case of Nyanga Donna Yolanda, who argues that many important people go looking for the treatment in the night, hoping not to be recognized, and even some pastors do it, despite demonizing the Nyanga in public context. Thus, Clayton comes back to the opposition, tradition, civilization, and asserts that spiritual leaders do not overcome this dichotomy. Instead, they deal with the difference by demonizing the other in order to create space and audience for themselves. And at the same time, the pastors and the prophets invent juxtapositions in between the two spheres. So the negotiation on different spiritual therapies in modern issues is negotiated. Therapies are interwoven with the idea that ancestors have a role in the life of people. The independent churches in many cases mimic or use ceremonial symbols that belong to the traditional context. In some, Clayton argues that the process of differentiating still goes along with the dichotomy between certain terms: good, bad, pure, impure, developed, primitive, rational, irrational, normal, abnormal, civilized, uncivilized, traditional, civilized, modern. Although people keep thinking that access to all sorts of ritual therapies may be successful and important without disregarding the others. Finally, there is a chapter by Paulo Ricardo Muller on Cabinda in the region in Angola. He introduces this article by explaining how the ethnographic encounter has occurred. After a research on presence of Congolese in northern Cabinda, he was requested to come back in Cabinda to study the Cabinda's tradition. So a local actor asked him and introduced him in a network of relations. The question which epitomizes the reason for the latter research question was, as tradições não se fazem sentir, that is something like traditions do not show themselves. This part of the article is particularly important because it shows both the positioning of the researcher in the context, but also the position of the leaders of the secret society of the traditional dance group of the Bacama, located in Chizo, a borough on the top of the hill overlooking the town of Cabinda, whom he pretended to study. The leader asked for a huge amount of money for himself in order to open the relations with the researchers by recounting some of the history of the dance group and of the population of the Chizo borough himself. We don't know whether Paulo Muller then gave this money and got this meeting, probably not, or maybe yes, probably not. This attitude of requesting much payment, though, is important for disclosing any information on the dance group because it goes together with the fact that an enormous amount of money and goods are handed to these dance groups by politicians or companies who request their performance for opening ceremonies of big infrastructures or support for political events. The amount was large to the extent that some cars were pointed out as parts of those bills. It is to be clarified that in Angola or Congo, the permission of traditional authorities to enter in specific areas, such as for constructions of bridges or allowances, is required to make sure that chiefs are consenting. If a chief of land, chef de terra, does not allow the work, people believe that misfortune will certainly occur. But the request from the grassroots people of the borough that traditional dances be performed more frequently for the borough itself, that young people be introduced in such a circle, thus contrasts with the strict policy of the group, which now mainly performs for firms who can pay much for the services and no longer for the community. The cost of the performance had become exceedingly high for the local people to be able to afford it. This appears even more strange because the Bacama earlier in the years were those who preserved from modernization the Chizo borough, prohibiting the use of electricity and of cement in the constructions to preserve tradition. In other words, a negotiation is occurring in the traditional ceremonies as they became allowed in commercial spaces and restricted in the community ones. This has become an arena where actors relate positions themselves play a role in controversial issues and conflict and structure symbolical fields. The restrictions on performances has arrived to the extent that the authorities of the borough also claim more access to the sphere of the secret society's dance to be able to exert influence on the way traditional symbols are utilized and managed. But here the discussion on traditional category of differentiations becomes more refined, being entangled with the production of written works describing the tradition which are produced with the idea of codifying a tradition. Paolo, in this research in Cabinda, in fact, also met the director of Cabinda Museum, which was in the process of restructuring, and realizes he uses a book by the title of Cabinda, Historia, Crenza, Usus y Costumbres, written by the Spiritan Father Joaquim Martins in 1972, as reference for what he considers tradition. The museum director defined the book as resulting from Trabalho da Tradição, work on tradition. That's what the museum director considered tradition was what missionaries had codified as tradition, a history of the colonial relation between Portugal and Cabinda, and a functional description of practices, institutions, and principles of social organization of the Cabinda society, which reflected the interaction of the Spiritan Father with a number of interlocutors of the societies along 22 years in the missions. So, Paulo Müller analyzes the epistemological basis of missionaries' literatures, the interaction between orality and written sources as regards tradition, mentioning Goody, and talking about orality considered as primitive and written classified as civilized. Fanning arrives to conceive tradition not only as a category in opposition to modern civilized developed, but as expression of an ante-colonial logic, that is, a precondition preceding colonialism, clearly a distinct category from anti-colonial, which instead qualifies the movement and conflicts contrary or opposite to colonialism. Proposing the category anti-colonialism, which means logic preceding colonialism and derives from a discussion by Braga and Kine, is important because it helps not to confuse post-colonial and post-colonial. Post-colonial being a category which includes many intellectual positionings dedicated to deconstruct and overcome concepts, theories, or methodologies developed basically during colonial times under colonial regimes in situations of great economic inequality. And then he supports the idea that tradition, according to different authors, is a category which naturalizes inequalities, naturalizes racist criteria, and is a preconceived notion which transposes to Africa the European experience of classifying non-industrialized societies, like those kind of societies, to be overcome by modernity. So a category which maintains separated the particularities of African societies and a basic conception that inequality between colonizers and colonized was natural. So the idea of considering tradition as ante-colonial, that is a cultural logic preceding colonialism, but not the opposite to modernizations, allows to understand the tradition in dialogic relations with the institution which they face. Some of them, for instance, that once the Bacama brand for selling better their products, and this is not seems like a problem for the Bacamas. Their tradition is not in opposition to modernity. And then I have a question here that if he had expected the issue of to what extent the secret society dance has conveyed other meanings. I mentioned the example of other two kinds of dances in Mozambique, like the Gulu Wankulu at the crossroads among Mozambique, Zambia, and Malawi, or the Mapico in the Makonde of northern Mozambique, in which performing dances of secret societies means also discussing publicly political meanings through a form which is sometimes similar to a Greek tragedy. Now, wrapping all up, the question is how to compare all these works that deal with so many different issues. One important aspect of comparisons is how difference has been created in a relatively short periods of time, like the paper of the women in liberation movement in Mozambique, or longer time, the Araujo, where the education among the Kikuyu is analyzed from early 20th century to the 60s, by deepening certain separations between people or by creating completely new ones. Or also to look at how differences are usually created by proposing dichotomies which look more or less convincing, such as modern primitive or educated civilized versus uneducated uncivilized, collaborationist revolutionary. See, for instance, the article on Cabinda, in which the way to actually understand what is happening with the traditional secret society group, which now are selling themselves to important political figures and businessmen is possibly unrelated to modernity, but rather is a form of dialogue with a wider political arena. Or even the category colonial, post-colonial has become a confusing one because not everything changed because of colonialism. Other logic concerning tradition unrelated to colonialism may be at stake, even if colonialism has existed and also has gone now. Thus, we may have to think that conceptual dichotomies are often dangerous way of interpreting cultural phenomena, although they are the ones that are more easily understandable, but also polarized in political discourses and are able to mobilize social movements. See, for instance, the case of the Guinea-Bissau. Differences are also created by violence and war. The most radical case described in this book is that of Yugoslavia, where people have been forcibly removed from where they were, and the separation has been marked on the body of the raped women. However, also other cases of new differences have been based on a violent war, and even if they are named revolutions, fight for liberation, resistance, have deepened the ethnic lines in Guinea-Bissau, or the local inhabitants of Inyambani whose lands have been alienated in favor of ex-combatants, the women who fought in the liberation movement in Mozambique who achieved many more rights than they had, or the Kikuyu negotiations occurred in periods ravaged by violent events. What I mean is that sometimes differences arise after violent events without taking. The other aspect that can be analyzed is that differences push and can raise a lot of sentiment, emotions, and dichotomies about differences. Consider, for instance, Donna Regina or the other Donna who continue navigating among different sources of spiritual powers, trying to find the best ones for solving their problems. They keep wondering about those who are, and plus those who are on a negative pole of the dichotomy may be pushed to change their position in the category out to get to the positive one. And if new categories are constructed abruptly by a war like in ex-Yugoslavia, then people experience many sorts of emotion from anger to frustration, desire of vengeance, absence, and all the sad feelings that were described by the author here in this book. Some of the chapters of the entire work speaks more directly to each other and in an interesting way. For instance, Melvina de Araujo tackles the way independent churches got audience and relevance in Kenya because they supported independent school, which the people considered important in order to steal the secrets of the British. Clayton observes how independent churches develop discourses in Mozambique to differentiate themselves and create space for their own churches and audience. Thus, we do have strategies of the same churches in different geographical areas and at different times compared through the use of difference. So, I think that I probably will stop here with some, and thank you very much for letting me discussing the book that offered many insights for reflections, but we'll talk more, I guess, today.
Thank you very much, Francesca, for your very, very interesting commentaries. I would like to invite the authors of the book to interact with us, like Andrea, Clayton, Paulo, Rodrigo, Érico and Marina. They are here, and I think that they could introduce in the room. I would to discuss a little about the difference that are made more convincing for the Kikuyus, because there is an interesting case with the Mau Mau guerrilla that divided the Kikuyu in pro-breaches, the real of breaches, colonizers, and the anti-breach colonizers. In the beginning, they are all against the breach, the European at all, but at the end, at the end of the guerrilla, some of these Europeans are considered like friends of Kikuyus. They are the Consolata missioners. They are Italian, and like Francesca said, they were also prisoners of the breacher prisoners in the Second War. And they stayed with the Kikuyu in Kenya when the guerrilla began, and all other Europeans go out of Kenya in this period because they were afraid. But the Consolata missioner, they stayed, and they helped a lot of Kikuyus. And after all, the guerrillas, the warriors, because they asked for help. They asked. There are interesting case. I think Francesca knows a lot because Bernardo Bernardi. He was a Consolata missionary also. He was anthropologist and a Consolata missionary in this period, and one of the activities not of all these missionaries, but of an activity of some of these missionaries, it was to carry out the messages or letters from the prisons to the families, the prisoners' families, and vice versa. And in this way, they could help a lot of people to have some news. The families and the prisoners have news one from the others, and in this way they could consider the Consolata missioners like friends. And after the guerrilla, the Mau Mau guerrilla, they were there was a movement for to construct the schools. In the first moment, the schools that was the independent schools, that was the schools constructed by the Kikuyus before the guerrilla, that was prohibited by the colonial breachers. And after this, Kikuyu, they asked that asked consultant missionaries to conduct these schools. And after this moment, they begin to construct a lot of schools, and in this way we can observe that they chose one kind of difference between the Kikuyus that didn't want to study, to learn some European customs or values, and others that take for them some aspect of European culture, like scholarizations, etc. I would like now to know if someone of the authors would like to speak a little.
We can also speak in Portuguese if anybody wants to.
Ok.
Está bom para mim. Estaria
Tudo
bom.
bem, então. Alguém de vocês quer falar? Andréia, Paulo, Rodrigo, Cleiton, Érico, Marina.
I forgot a question for you, Marina. Is that do you have any information on ethnic groups who did not accept education? Because, of course, the Kikuyu were the ones who mainly, wanted that, but others really didn't.
Não tinha muitos outros envolvidos na guerrilha Mau-Mau. Nós tínhamos alguns embos e meros, mas muito poucos. Outros grupos, o Quênia tem mais de 40 etnias, né, que foram classificadas durante o período colonial, mas essas outras etnias não se envolveram na guerrilha Mau-Mau. E o contato que os missionários da Consolata vão ter com elas vão ser posteriores, vão começar no final dos anos 50, mais propriamente nos anos 60, que vai ser quando eles têm autorização do governo colonial para adentrar outras áreas que não aquela área que havia sido circunscrita para eles no começo, que era uma pequena área, uma parte da área que Kikuyu, uma área do Quênia Central. Depois disso, tinha uma outra pequena missão em Mombasa, mas essa tinha pouca, digamos, interação, porque Mombasa é uma área, sobretudo, muçulmana, né? Depois disso, nos anos 60, eles vão começar a missionar mais ao norte do Quênia, e onde tem populações nômades, sobretudo, como Samburu, Turkana, entre outras. Não sei se eu te respondi, Francesca.
Sim. Olha, Paulo está a pedir se tem acesso ao microfone, se ele.
Acho que eles têm. Paulo, peraí. Vamos ver. Michel, você pode dar acesso ao Paulo Miller, ao microfone, por favor?
Bom dia. Quem quiser fazer uso da palavra pode fazer, só precisa alterar aí que vocês entraram todos com modo ouvinte. Então, é só dar Alt L, depois Alt J e escolher a opção microfone.
Obrigada, Michel. Em relação à não aceitação da educação, Francesca, outros grupos, isso é muito lento. Eu não tenho números exatos, mas alguns têm uma maior resistência a aceitá-lo, mas sobretudo os nômades, que ainda hoje uma parte deles não quer ir para a escola. Ou vai num período bem cedo, quando as crianças são bem pequenas, e sobretudo as meninas, depois elas abandonam a escola, sobretudo quando elas colocam o colar, as tucanas colocam colar, quando começam a fazer os rituais para o casamento. Né?
Uhum.
Paulo, você já está com acesso ao microfone? Acho que está tendo algum problema. Deixa eu ver se eu consigo falar com ele.
Por exemplo, não sei se
Que, Francesca?
sim, por exemplo, para a Guiné-Bissau, também tinha essa pergunta, qual é assim, o papel da televisão nesta polarização contra os pulas? Se tem um papel a televisão, os meios de comunicação de massa.
Acho que o Érico não está aqui, não estou vendo ele aqui.
Ok, tá bom.
Mas eu acho que eu consigo responder isso. Segundo o Érico, a televisão ainda tem uma entrada muito pequena na Guiné. Talvez, tem uma guineense aqui, a Petit, talvez ela possa me ajudar. Mas o que o Érico me disse que a televisão, na verdade, está começando a entrar lá, segundo ele, não teria tanta influência assim. É isso mesmo, Petit?
Oi.
Oi, você está aí. Diga.
Gente, é um exercício, sim, de entrar, ter que ligar. Bom dia, boa tarde a todas e a todos. É isso, assim, a televisão ainda tem uma limitação de atingir a população guinense no todo, especialmente nas regiões, nos interiores, fica muito limitada mais no capital do país. Por exemplo, eu sou da região de Cacheu, mas em termos da comunicação social, principalmente televisão, assim, é muito limitada. Se você conta os lugares que pode encontrar, até pela questão da rede mesmo, assim. O que é mais comum é as rádios, né? As rádios comunitárias, assim, chegam nesses lugares, tanto região, setores, para a questão de comunicação e informação. Mas é isso, Mel, é isso mesmo. Tem muita limitação enquanto a TV.
Ok. Obrigada, Petit.
Boa tarde, good afternoon.
Boa tarde.
Boa tarde.
Bom, em português mesmo? Tá, ok. Não, antes de mais nada, agradecer a professora Francesca pelos comentários e pelos destaques, né, aos capítulos. Relativamente ao meu capítulo especificamente, acho que tem duas coisas que você destacou, Francesca, que são muito caras ao desenvolvimento da pesquisa, considerando como tudo aconteceu. A primeira é essa ênfase, vamos dizer assim, em mostrar a posição do pesquisador em relação aos seus interlocutores, né, e tanto em relação aos seus interlocutores mais próximos, fizeram aquela mediação, né, que me chamaram de volta para a Cabinda para estudar as tradições, né, quanto com relação aos líderes, no caso dos Bacama do Tiso, mas também de outras aldeias, que foi o modo como eu também consegui acessar essa controvérsia em torno das tradições não se fazerem sentir, né, na expressão mais comum em Cabinda. Então, esse foi um investimento, vamos dizer assim, né, que eu fiz na pesquisa, enfim, para também tentar mostrar que esses dados sobre Cabinda, né, ou enfim, a discussão sobre tradição, ela não parte unicamente de um olhar para o passado e para determinados objetos ou símbolos já definidos, já pré-estabelecidos. Né? A ideia foi mostrar que o que é tradição está em negociação, né? E, portanto, também, eventualmente, isso pode ter implicado também em algumas, pelo menos nesse texto, né, implicado em algumas ausências, né, como, por exemplo, essa comparação com outras fontes de exemplos, né, de danças mascaradas, como dos Maconde, também nos Camarões, né, é um lugar onde eu encontrei alguns exemplos, né, e acabei enfatizando, então, esse campo, essa arena local, cabindesa, de discussão sobre o que é tradição, ou seja, um contexto em que o que é tradição está sendo definido, constantemente definido e redefinido, e não propriamente apontando para o que deve ser preservado ou não, né? Como seria uma discussão mais clássica, mais museológica, mais cristalizada de tradição. E o outro ponto que você levantou muito, de forma muito apropriada, diz respeito ao uso que eu fiz dessa categoria, né, que é da lógica antecolonial ou da antecolonialidade, que se diferencia, que eu procurei pelo menos diferenciar ao mesmo tempo da anticolonialidade, né, ou do anticolonial e do pré-colonial também. E realmente me parece que esse foi um ganho da pesquisa, né, uma discussão que eu não cheguei a fazer, por exemplo, na minha tese de doutorado, né, mas que agora eu tive essa oportunidade de, junto ao GEMA, desenvolver esse argumento a respeito dos dados da minha pesquisa, né, de que essas categorias ou essas posições dos sujeitos, né, nesses campos do que é tradicional ou do que não é tradicional, e o não tradicional ele pode remeter à modernidade, mas pode remeter também ao Estado, ao mercado, ao desenvolvimento, enfim, né? Ou seja, não parte da ideia de modernidade como algo unívoco, como algo inteiro, né? Como algo cristalizado. E a ideia foi justamente mostrar que essas dicotomias elas também estão sendo discutidas pelos atores, pelos interlocutores em campo, e não somente na teoria antropológica ou na teoria social de uma forma mais ampla. Então, esses sujeitos eles estão informando o modo também como eu e acredito que outros pesquisadores pensam e apreendem, né, essas categorias de tradição, de modernidade ou do que se opõe à tradição em diferentes contextos. Em Moçambique, por exemplo, a principal categoria que se opõe à tradição, segundo alguns pesquisadores, e o Clayton mostrou um pouco isso também, né, é a categoria de civilização, né, e não tanto a de modernidade. Então, mesmo que nós, do ponto de vista acadêmico, entendemos que a modernidade é um adjetivo, né, é uma qualidade de tudo isso, né, do Estado, do mercado, do desenvolvimento, localmente do ponto de vista êmico, né, os sujeitos não enxergam da mesma forma. Então, isso, considerando, né, a nossa área, considerando a antropologia, o objetivo da antropologia de tentar entender essas perspectivas nativas, endógenas, enfim, me parece ser uma discussão bastante importante e promissora, né, que o meu artigo nada mais do que toca, nada mais do que tangencia, né, essa questão, mas acho que é uma discussão para ser levada adiante. Então, mais uma vez, muito obrigado e espero que continuemos esse diálogo.
Obrigada, Paulo. Os outros membros do GEMA, por favor, se manifestem.
Olá, estão me ouvindo?
Sim, Andréia.
Olá, Andréa.
Não, só para agradecer muito a leitura que a Francesca fez do nosso trabalho, digamos que a nossa primeira leitora, assim, de fora desse trabalho, do resultado, né, do trabalho final e dessa tentativa ousada de juntar esses diferentes contextos num mesmo lugar, especialmente a minha pesquisa na Bósnia, né? E que a gente acaba pensando como cada vez é mais interessante você sair, né, dessas fronteiras que a gente cria para as nossas próprias reflexões. Então, é agradecer mesmo essa oportunidade de poder ser lida. E só isso mesmo, vou dar a palavra para os outros, e se alguém tiver alguma pergunta específica, enfim, fique à vontade.
Ok, André, obrigada. Cleiton, Rodrigo, Marina. Acho que os meninos hoje estão um pouco tímidos, Francesca, eles não estão querendo falar. Isso é raro, eles geralmente falam bastante. Mas eu gostaria de perguntar para os outros também, se alguém tem mais, alguém tem alguma outra pergunta? Vocês podem tanto falar ou escrever no chat. Bom,
uma coisa que não, é impressionante a representação da Andrea sobre a questão que os espaços agora não falam mais como antes, quando tem a diferença é criada também sobre a ressignificação dos espaços. Então, tem bastante informação sobre essas pessoas que passam para a rua e a rua mudou de nome, todo mudou, não é mais a mesma rua de antes, e a pessoa só tem um nome, mas todo é cambiado. Então, é muito profunda, eu acho que foram bastante profundas aqueles relatórios etnográficos das emoções criadas para a diferença. E acho que o artigo que mais fala de emoções criadas para a diferença, e é uma coisa importante porque nem sempre fala-se, mas é exatamente as coisas sobre as quais tem mudanças depois, não? Porque quando tem emoções sobre certas coisas, pode ter mudança ou pode não ter.
Sim, acho que esse é um aspecto, você tem toda a razão, Francesca, acho que esse é um aspecto bastante interessante que a pesquisa da Andrea acaba mostrando para a gente, porque acho que tem uma pequena diferença de perspectiva aqui, talvez no modo ou nos temas que são mais que têm suscitado mais interesses, porque a Andrea ela vai focar justamente sobre aquilo que não se fala a partir das guerras, né? Das coisas sobre as quais se tem dificuldade de falar, a falta que as pessoas sentem de um outro tempo, de um outro tipo de convivência, em que eles podiam viver em determinados lugares em que agora não se pode mais viver, em que tinham relações com pessoas com as quais eles não podem mais se relacionar. E o que é interessante é que, no contexto africano, o que a gente tem visto, mais que falar dessas impossibilidades, é uma retomada de uma memória dessas guerras de independência para tentar garantir alguns lugares no contexto atual, né? no período contemporâneo. Então, a gente vê, no contexto queniano, por exemplo, nós temos o surgimento ou a consolidação de alguns partidos políticos que querem tomar para si a bandeira dos Mau-Mau, né? Como se eles são aqueles que são legítimos de permanecerem no poder, porque eles são os herdeiros, eles seriam, né, os herdeiros do Mau-Mau. E um dos líderes desse partido é o Kenyatta, o filho, que é o atual presidente, e é filho do Jomo Kenyatta, que foi o primeiro presidente do Quênia independente. E o que é bastante interessante observar nisso aí é que o próprio Jomo Kenyatta sempre negou sua participação junto à guerrilha Mau-Mau, apesar dele ter sido condenado como sendo um dos seus chefes. Bom, pelo que dizem os historiadores, não há nada que permita afirmar que ele tenha feito parte dos Mau-Mau, muito pelo contrário, ele era contrário àquele tipo de organização política baseada no uso da violência. E agora o seu filho reivindica uma certa filiação à guerrilha Mau-Mau para garantir um lugar na condução do Estado queniano. O Moçambique também tem alguns, principalmente agora, com toda a questão envolvendo alguns grupos islâmicos, que em Cabo Delgado, sobretudo, que tá mais presente na mídia, em que também se retoma toda uma questão relativa a algumas diferenciações que tiveram lugar no período da independência, sobretudo diferenciações regionais entre aqueles do sul de Moçambique e os do norte, do centro e do norte de Moçambique. Então, só para colocar dois contextos dos contextos africanos nos quais essa memória das independências ela atua de uma forma diferente daquela que vai ter na Bósnia, a partir da pesquisa da Andrea, que não é uma guerra de independência, mas foi um outro tipo de guerra, mas que em todos esses... Bom, nós temos questões semelhantes aí, mas temos algumas questões que diferenciam esses contextos.
Posso só fazer um parêntese, né? Claro. Eu concordo com o que a Melvina falou, mas assim, que as pessoas não podem, né? A questão é só para deixar claro que esse poder não necessariamente está colocado por alguma lei, alguma obrigação, a um estado policial. Então, acho que talvez não seja uma palavra correta, mas é sim o foco nas emoções, aquele seu sentir-se deslocado num espaço que, enfim, a princípio você pode sim estar nele, mas você não se sente mais parte dele. Então, é por isso que esse olhar para emoções, ele é muito interessante, né? Porque ele mostra outros enfoques, né? Sobre mesmo. E eu acho que esses deslocamentos, né, que eu menciono no meu artigo, ele acho que é uma linha interessante para se olhar em diversos contextos em que você tem, sabe, conflitos, migrações, né? É um deslocar físico, mas é um deslocar também de emoções, de sentir-se no lugar ou não sentir-se, do próprio sujeito, como ele se constitui, ele se pensa e como ele constrói suas relações. Então foi um pouco nesse sentido também que o meu artigo ele entrou, né, nessa coletânea com os estudos, a maioria se voltam para contextos africanos, né? Então é isso.
Obrigada. Bom, Francesca, não sei se eu acho que a gente tem que encerrar, porque o limite era 12:30, mas eu gostaria de agradecer imensamente a sua participação, a sua boa vontade, a forma cuidadosa com que você leu os nossos textos, leu e comentou os nossos textos. Para a gente é bastante importante, porque é a primeira leitura que nós temos depois de concluído esse trabalho. Enfim, e aí eu espero eu acho que nós todos do GEM esperamos que a gente possa continuar esse diálogo, e talvez até, se você concordar, publicar no próprio livro o seu comentário com uma apresentação, não sei se isso...
Eu vou ficar com ele para refinar melhor, nesse caso.
Vai ter tempo. Não tem problema. Então, eu gostaria, mais uma vez, de agradecer a sua participação. Muito obrigada pela leitura.
Sim, espero nos encontramos mais pronto, também temos mais convênios organizados, esperamos tudo. E eu acho que também discussões como esta têm que fazer sempre mais também na mirada da WCA, que é de compartilhar conceitos across the countries.
Right.
Dos países.
You are absolutely right.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you then. Thank you to all and for listening as well.
Ok. Muito obrigada a todas e todos que participaram. Muito obrigada ao Camilo, que organizou esse debate. Obrigada ao Michel, que está aqui nos assessorando. E espero que a gente possa se ver brevemente. Até logo a todos.
Até logo. E boa sorte com essa situação.